Martin Luther King, Chapter 2. We spoke in Oslo of the long road we had come, but no one who has not traveled it could possibly envision how very long it was. Martin and I both had a heritage deeply rooted in the southern soil. I had grown up in the rural South, while he was a product of the urban South. Consequently, our backgrounds were dissimilar. I was born in a modest house on my grandfather's farm, 12 miles out in the country from Marion, Alabama. My father, Obadiah Scott, whom everybody calls Obie, built the house in 1920, the year he and my mother, Bernice McMurray Scott, married. It was an unpainted frame structure that had once been papered on the inside, but by the time I can remember, the paper was fairly worn off. There were 2 large rooms, a kitchen and a bedroom, and a front porch. The bedroom was heated by an open fireplace. There were 2 double beds, 1 dresser, and a wardrobe. One of our prized possessions was a Victrola, which stood on the floor, and we had an unusual collection of records. I remember such treasures as Clara and Bessie Smith recordings, sermons, also jazz recordings, as well as popular songs and hymns. The kitchen was of unfinished pine with plain floors. Mother cooked on a big wood-burning iron stove equipped with a food warmer and hot water tank, which was also a source of heat for the kitchen. There was a rough carpenter's kitchen table and several chairs with cane seats. In the back of the room there was a safe, a chest similar to a china closet. Though the furniture was simple, it was on a very large scale for our small house. It was a family joke that Dad always bought the biggest of everything he could find. We were fortunate to have a well in the backyard which furnished water the year round. Many other people had to tote water from the nearest stream or spring. When the drought season came, sometimes the springs and even the wells would dry up. I remember my cousins climbing up and down the steep hill in their house with buckets of water for their large family. As a child, I would watch them and feel grateful for our well. When we wanted to wash, water was heated outdoors in a big iron pot over a fire. We had 2 large tin tubs and a rub board with which we washed the clothes. My grandfather, Jeff Scott, was born in 1873. He and my grandmother, Cora Scott, worked long hours in the field and sold pine timber in order to get together enough money to acquire the farm they both longed for. The struggle drove Cora Scott to an early grave. But by the time I knew my grandfather, he owned 300 acres of land and was an important man in the rural black community. Whatever Jeff Scott said, people listened to. Jeff Scott either led or played an important role in everything involving the uplift of the people in our community. He was the preacher's steward and chairman of the board of trustees of our church, the Mount Tabor AME, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and also superintendent of the Sunday school. His positions as preacher's steward and president of the Rising Star Burial Society required him to travel a great deal to church conferences and burial association meetings. All the Negroes in Marion called him Mr. Scott. Of course, members of his own family called him Uncle Jeff or Cousin Jeff, and almost everyone in Marion was related in some way or another. My father was one of 13 children, and when my grandmother died at the age of 40, grandfather married Fanny Burroughs and had 12 more children. At age 68, grandfather Scott was killed in an automobile accident, and his death left a real leadership vacuum in our small community. I often wish I had known my grandmother Cora, especially since I carry part of her name. It was said that she was a real inspiration behind the success of Jeff Scott. She was a woman of unusual strength and drive. When I was growing up, my mother often told me that I reminded her of grandmother Cora. Though he was harder to know than grandfather Scott, I think my maternal grandfather, Martin McMurray, was a very interesting man. He was part American Indian and was born just before the Emancipation Proclamation. Short of stature with a very sturdy frame, he was fair-skinned, and as he grew older he looked more and more like an Indian, with his straight black hair and bold features. Grandfather McMurray would be considered semi-literate by modern educational standards. He said he went to school about 2 days in his life, but he taught himself to read the Bible, and that was all he ever read. He never tried to read the newspaper, but he had a library of reference books that interpreted passages in the Bible. He became such an authority that people would say, "If you want to know anything about the Bible or a passage of Scripture, ask Brother McMurray." His vocabulary was fantastic. I remember him very well, a strong man even in his old age. When he was over 70, he would walk 12 miles to Marion from his 300-acre farm and back in a day. He was unyielding and very strict, and believed that children should be seen and not heard. When we used to visit him, we would have to play very quietly if he happened to be indoors reading or meditating. If we made a noise, he would come out and threaten to whip us. He shared the philosophy held by many adults at the time, that children should be seen and not heard. I wish I had talked to him more, but we were afraid of him. Grandfather McMurray was well respected in the black as well as the white community, if you can use that word for the kind of respect white people had for Negroes at the time. Of course, they never thought of us as being real people, as equals. Both of my grandfathers were leading men in the community, but Martin McMurray lived close to the soil, never owned an automobile, and seldom traveled outside of 15-mile radius. Thus, his activities were confined to our immediate community and church. On the other hand, Grandfather Scott regularly traveled all over the county in his automobile, attending and speaking at meetings of the various organizations he headed or was affiliated with, as well as in connection with being an insurance salesman. He was deeply concerned with the religious, civic, business, and political aspects of the life of our community. His world reached far into the larger community of the overall South and the nation. My grandmother McMurray was a very gentle woman, a typical loving and indulgent grandmother. She was of average height, with fair skin and curly hair. A good seamstress, she made most of our clothes while we were growing up. She loved flowers and had a beautiful garden on which she spent a lot of time. My mother and she were very close. Mother was the baby of the family and would turn to her own mother whenever she needed help. My father is also an unusual person, as you had to be to get anywhere at all in the days if you were black. A born leader, he was a good combination of both his parents. I often wonder how he and Daddy King ever made it, for all the cards were stacked against them. They were both born in the beginning of the century, which, in the South, was the very worst period of the repression of the Negro since the days of slavery. After the Civil War, when the Negroes were made free by the Emancipation Proclamation and given the vote and legal equality by the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, things were better for a while. Black people did vote, and they enjoyed a certain amount of freedom. Then the federal occupation troops were pulled out, and the white Southerners began the process of eroding Negro rights. They were a little careful at first, but in the 1880s and 1890s, with very conservative Republican federal governments in office, the local governments really clamped down. It was then that several of the Southern states put the grandfather clauses in their constitutions. Under these rulings, no one was eligible to vote unless his grandfather had been a voter. Of course, most of our grandfathers had been slaves, so that effectively disfranchised almost the entire black population. Another device to keep blacks from voting was the high poll tax. It cost $2 to vote in Alabama. But if you were, for example, 30 years old the first time you voted, you had to pay all the back taxes from the time you were 21. In this case, $20, a large part of the annual income of many people at that time. This trick was almost as effective as the grandfather clauses, because very few black people could afford to pay that much to vote. In 1940, in Marion and the surrounding countryside where we lived, there were about 1,000 whites and 2,000 Negroes. But even as late as 1955, only about 150 black people were registered to vote. That was not the worst of it. After the People versus Ferguson decision of the Supreme Court in 1896, legalizing segregation, or separate but equal facilities, the Jim Crow laws passed by the white legislatures went to horrible and ridiculous lengths. They made it illegal for blacks and whites to eat together in public, to sit together in theaters, businesses, or trains, to use the same comfort stations or water fountains, even to enter the public buildings by the same door. It was as though the blacks had some contagious disease. And yet we worked in their houses, prepared their food, nursed their children, and were intimately associated with them in every domestic way. The whole idea was to impress upon the black people that they were an inferior race, to reduce us, not to slavery again, but to being less than men. Negroes, no matter what their position or how much education they had, were never called Mr. or any other title. They were addressed as boy or girl, even if they were old and gray. They were supposed to say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, even to teenage whites. It was all deliberately aimed at instilling the slave mentality into our people. Unhappily, the whites succeeded all too frequently for many years. How sad it made me feel to see some of our people who had been so badly treated. When they spoke to a white person, their backbones seemed to crumple. They seemed diminished. After we became involved in the movement, Martin would say to his oppressed brothers and sisters, "We can straighten our backs and walk erect now. We are walking to freedom in dignity." During those earlier years, any Negro who stood up like a man was considered uppity. If he went too far, or even if he merely tried to assert his legal rights, he was in grave danger of disappearing. The authorities never investigated. A black man's life was worthless. Of course, in any direct clash or an accusation by a white woman against him, the Negro man was almost invariably lynched. One of my great uncles was lynched. A kindly white woman came and told his wife what had happened. When she went out looking, she found his body hanging from a tree, and after they had strung him up, the lynch mob must have used him for target practice. His body was full of bullet holes. The system of slavery and consequent segregation as practiced in the United States is the most vicious and evil sin against humanity anywhere. It created within the white man a false sense of superiority, while instilling in the black man a false sense of inferiority. Racism, as we define it today, is deeply rooted in these inhuman practices. It is a wonder that my own father did not end up in a swamp because of his obvious self-respect. His additional and unforgivable crime was that he worked too hard and got ahead of some of the poor whites. When he and my mother were married, he got a steady job in one of the local sawmills, earning $3 a day. By the time I was born, he had saved enough money to buy a truck and was hauling logs and timber for the local sawmill operator. He had also learned the barber's trade, and in the evenings and on the weekends there might be a line of men outside our house waiting to have their hair cut. Mother would help him by cutting hair when there were more customers than my father could handle. Because of the Depression, he began what was called truck farming. On our piece of land, we raised corn, peas, potatoes, and garden vegetables. We had hogs, cows, and chickens. Because Daddy was always working all day, Mother, my sister Edith, and I tended the crops. We started as soon as we were big enough to hold a hoe. I was 6 or 7. My sister Edith, my brother Obie, and I tended the garden and the crops. Mother assisted us when there was a lot to do. My father hired someone to plow the fields, but we planted the corn, hoed it, and gathered it, fed the chickens and the hogs, and milked the cows. We did not sell the produce. We and the animals ate it. Even if we had not needed it, living on a farm without growing things was unthinkable. It still is to my parents, who grow cotton and corn to this day. Later, when I was about 10, I worked in the cotton fields with the hired hands. I hoed and chopped the cotton, that is, thinning out the rows so you leave a hose width between one stalk and the next. In fall, we picked cotton. We hired ourselves out to make money to help with our school needs. If you made $4 or $5 in the course of the season, that was pretty good money in those Depression days. I remember one special year when I made $7 picking cotton. I was always very strong, and I made a very good cotton picker. Martin used to tease me about it years later, saying that is why he married me. He would say, if you hadn't met me, you'd still be down there picking cotton. So we all worked, but Daddy worked harder than almost anyone for miles around. With both of my parents while both of my parents shared the feeling that we must learn how to work, my father seemed to have a passion for keeping busy. He used to chide us about getting up early, saying, "When I was growing up at home, we ate breakfast every morning by lamplight. If you don't have anything to do, just get up and sit down. I won't have lazy people in my house." Like most people who have debts, when the Depression hit, my father suffered badly. He was still paying for his truck and could not earn enough to make his payments. A white man, whom we shall call John Thomas, took up his payments, but held the mortgage on his truck. He was the man of my childhood, a great exploiter of Negroes. Imagine in the 20th century hundreds of people who were living on this man's plantation and working for him. He owned the general merchandise store where they bought their food on credit, yarn goods, and all other things they needed. Thus, when they got paid at the end of the season, most if not all of what they had earned, they owed to him. He also owned a share in the lumber company for which my father worked. Mr. Thomas knew that my father was a good steady worker, so he made the payments on the truck. Then Daddy worked for him, not as a sharecropper, but hauling lumber and logs. Mr. Thomas never paid him quite what was owed, but my father knew it was useless to complain. In addition, Thomas sold us gasoline and oil for the truck, food staples, and other essentials at high prices. The interest he charged on the loans he made to my father, as well as other indebtedness, completely tied Daddy to him. My father's paycheck from the lumber mill would be sent to Mr. Thomas, who would then deduct what he wanted from it. What he wanted was all of it, and because Daddy was heavily in debt, this was what he got during the worst years of the Depression. Although he got no money to take home from his regular job, my father derived some income from hauling lumber for other people on the weekends and sometimes during the night. But even this got him into trouble with the poor whites. He was the only Negro who owned a truck. This brought him into competition with the whites, and they resented him. Sometimes they would stop him on a lonely road and curse him and threaten to kill him, and there was always a good chance they might do it. He was not a big man, only about 5'7", but he had a lot of courage. He never ran away, and I'm sure that is why he survived. He would stand up to them quietly and respectfully. My father used to say, if you look a white man in the eye, he can't hurt you. Daddy knew it was dangerous. After receiving so many open threats, he bought a pistol and carried it in the glove compartment of the truck. But I don't think he would have ever shot anyone. It would have been against all his principles. Many times during these years, when he left home to go to the deep woods to haul lumber, he'd say to Mother, "I may not get back." I learned very early to live with fear for the people I loved. It was good training, for I have lived that way most of my life. My father, in his bravery and his refusal to be beaten down, is very much the same kind of man my husband was. There was a curious destiny entangling my father and John Thomas. One day, about 1937, when my father was driving his truck, he collided with Mr. Thomas's car. I don't know whose fault it was, but the car was completely smashed, and Mr. Thomas was knocked unconscious. Though two of his helpers were slightly wounded, Daddy was not hurt at all, but he was terribly worried. If Thomas had died, they would have put him in jail for manslaughter, no matter what the rights of it, and he would not have had much chance for a fair trial. But Thomas recovered. He saw to it that my father did not have to serve any time. He considered that Obie was one of his hard-working, good niggers. He was reliable, didn't steal or drink, and took care of him in a condescending, patronistical way. But my father had to pay for the car. Though he had been doing pretty well and was steadily paying off his debts, it took my father several years to pay that new debt to Thomas. Finally, the day came when he went down to make the final payment. Mr. Thomas looked over his books and commended Obie for working so hard. Then he said, "Let's see. Oh, here's another $100 you owe me." My father knew it was not true. He had kept very careful records. But in order to avoid trouble, he agreed to pay it. This meant another 2 weeks' work before he was out of debt. He came home to us one night with $40 in his pocket. My little brother, Obie, and I were anxiously waiting for him. Edith was away at school. We were going to town, to Marion, and it was almost time for the stores to close. Mother was lying down, and Daddy came in and said, "Bernice, wake up. I can take you to town now and buy you what you want." It was a glorious occasion, because while we had been in debt we had to get everything at John Thomas's store. Now we all got into the truck and my father drove us to town. It was a great feeling for us, and how much greater it must have been for him to feel that once again he was a man who could run his own affairs. Since that time in 1939 he has run his own business and paid his bills, and if he needed money he has gone to the bank on his own name and collateral. When I was very young and growing up, I was protected from the extreme hardships of segregation, though I was always aware of being deprived of the rights to which I was entitled. We lived on that big farm, and up the hill were my Scott cousins and all my half-uncles and aunts and Grandfather Scott's second marriage to play with. There were also my cousins, Willie and Ruth McMurray, who were just about our age. It was an all-black community of 3 generations of land ownership. This factor, perhaps more than anything else, helped to instill in us racial pride, self-respect, and dignity, which inevitably gave us the proper self-image. My first experiences of social life were happy too. They centered around the Mount Tabor AME Zion Church. Most of the congregation were kinfolk, so it was almost a family affair. Church going on Sunday was the great occasion of the week. People came from long distances, sometimes in farm wagons or walking. Very few had cars. Everyone put on the best clothes they owned. The men wore suits when there was regular service. The women wore hats. I wore braids, and I remember my mother and sister fussing over them on Sunday mornings. Little girls in my church seldom wore ribbons, but on special occasions like Easter or Children's Day, when we had new clothes, we might have had ribbons to match our dresses. When we could not get a ride in my father's truck, we children could start walking early to get to church for Sunday school. Mount Tabor was about 4 miles from where we then lived, but we were used to walking. Though we ourselves did not, other people often carried their shoes, so they would not get muddy or dirty from the unpaved roads. They also carried a rag to wipe their feet before they put their shoes on at the church. Others wore old shoes on the road and changed them before they got into church. Grandfather Scott would open the Sunday school service by singing a hymn. We had a prayer in the large group, about 35 people. Then we went to our classes, where we were told Bible stories and taught the catechism. Who made you? God. Who is God? God is a spirit. Where is God? God is everywhere. What can God do? God can do everything. Does God know everything? He knows everything that we can think, say, or do. After Sunday school, there was recess, and older people began to arrive for the church services. To my eyes, when I was a small child, it was quite a big church. It was a frame structure with the white paint peeling off because it was painted only once every 10 years or so. There was an elevated pulpit with a railing around it where members of the congregation knelt for communion. The pews were rough, homemade wooden benches, though they were varnished. The church was heated by a big pot-belly stove, and on very cold days people clustered around it to keep warm. Kerosene lamps, looking much like the electric fixtures that replaced them some years later, hung down from the ceilings on long cords. The men and women usually sat in different aisles, and the young people in the middle aisles between them. Though I don't remember anyone speaking about it, it was rare for a man to sit with his wife. There were even 2 waiting rooms on each side of the foyer for different sexes. Mount Tabor Church was a 2-Sunday church. Since it could not afford a full-time minister, it hired a preacher to come twice a month. 2 Sunday churches are still fairly common in the South. On the odd Sundays, my grandfather Scott conducted the usual Sunday school service with prayers and readings from the Bible, and of course hymns. During the second service after the Sunday school, Grandfather McMurray, who had a fine, high baritone voice, would line the hymns, as it was called. That is, he would start off alone on perfect pitch, setting the meter, and the choir and the congregation would join in. Grandfather Scott would lead a prayer and maybe call on one of the brothers to read the lesson. Then he might give a little talk. There would be more hymn singing, Amazing Grace and Holy, 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 all the Methodist hymns. Of course, a collection would be taken up. On the Sundays when the minister preached, there were leaders who were supposed to collect from their group members. 25 cents a person was the proper amount, but that ran too high for large families, and 10 cents apiece was quite common. Except for what was paid to the bishop and for foreign missions, the money went to pay the pastors, and some people thought they were not worth what they got. Our church was one of the 3 leading churches in our district, which included 3 counties in the Black Belt area. Because Mount Tabor was considered a strong church, some of the better ministers were sent to us to preach. In general, though the ministers were well-meaning, they were often poorly educated and ill-prepared to serve the political and economic needs of their people. However, they laid a strong psychological and social foundation for coming generations. The churches they built were often the only institutions owned by black people. Without them, our modern movements would have been much more difficult. On the Sundays that the minister came, he would conduct the regular AMEZ service and then preach a sermon. If he were dull, some of the congregation went to sleep. Once in a while, one would come who preached a rousing sermon. People would become emotional and shout amen or yeah or preach. Still, the Methodists were not as emotional as the Baptists, and our members would make jokes about the carryings on of the Baptists. This church atmosphere was the cultural haven which gave birth to the present popular concept called soul. Soul music was the music of the black church almost a century ago, a mixture of African and American folklore in the context of the Christian religion. Seldom, if ever, did the preachers of that period deal directly with the plight of their people. Occasionally, when some black person had been beaten or otherwise badly treated by whites, there would be a reference to it from the pulpit. The preacher's role was to keep hope alive in a nearly hopeless situation. God loves us all, and people will reap what they sow, they would tell us. So just keep on praying, especially for our less fortunate brothers. The Bible teaches that, so don't worry. Someday God will straighten things out. They never preached that what we would now call the social gospel. Neither did they discuss from their pulpits Negro rights or the issues of segregation. It was too dangerous. This attitude was in some ways true of the men who gathered at our house to have their hair cut, or got together at the country store to discuss some injustice done to one of their brothers. They would talk about how unjustly Negroes were treated, some of them saying that what they would do if it happened to them. But there it ended. They felt it was hopeless to openly protest in those days. That was the way things were, though they hoped that things would get better. But to me, as a child, church was a warm and heartening experience, with my grandfathers leading the community and all my family there. It was the largest and most important part of my world. Even before my sister and I started school, my parents began to instill in us a desire for education. We had a few books in the house, which were read and reread. Among the ones which I remember, Mother used to read stories to us about Rumpelstiltskin and the Little Match Girl, and we learned Mary Had a Little Lamb, Humpty Dumpty, and other nursery rhymes. Mother had only a 4th grade education, which she got going to school 3 months a year, minding cows, and working in the fields the rest of the time. She married when she was 16 and began to have children. She used to say, "I never was a child. I've been a woman all my life." When I first remember her, she must have been still in her early 20s. When she did her hair in braids, she too looked like an Indian. Unlike my father, who is open-hearted and open-handed, my mother is reserved and cautious with strangers, especially white people. "You can't trust any of them," she said, though she does have white friends now whom she likes. But once she accepted you as a friend, she opened her heart. Despite her lack of education, she had a good mind and a lot of practical wisdom and understanding of life. She seemed more resentful of the injustice done Negroes than my father, who says that people are bad because conditions make them that way. He chooses to think the best about people. My parents realized how much they missed by not going through school, and my mother was determined that her children would get an education. My early schooling was greatly affected by the system of segregation. These impressionable years are so important in laying a solid foundation. Our Our elementary school was at Heiberger, a crossroads village nearer than Marion, but still about 3 miles from home. Rain or shine, we walked there and back every day, and I remembered that the buses carrying the white children to their school would rattle past us in a cloud of dust or spatter of mud. I remember resenting that. Our school was an unpainted frame building with one big room in which 100 or more children were taught in the 1st through 6th grades. Later, it was partitioned into 2 rooms and painted inside and out. There were combination wooden benches and desks that had been built by a local carpenter. Sections of the wall were painted black, and those served as blackboards. The toilets were outdoors, and the room was heated by the usual wood-burning stove. We had 2 Negro teachers, and they were dedicated women. They probably had junior college training, though in previous years you had only to pass an examination to begin teaching in black schools. Some people who passed only an 8th grade some people who had only an 8th grade education. Miss Maddie Bennett is one teacher who stands out in my memory as especially dedicated. Mrs. Bennett encouraged both Edith and me because she saw that we were eager to learn. I think she worked a little harder with us than with the other children, though perhaps part of her gift as a teacher was that she made us feel that way. Every so often the county supervisor, a Negro woman, would come around to inspect our school, and we would be on our best behavior to impress her. Our teacher was eager to demonstrate the talents of her pupils. As song leader, I was always asked to lead songs. Sometimes I sang solos or recited poetry. Despite efforts by Negro parents to protect their children from the dreadful hurt of segregation and discrimination, sooner or later all the Negro children lose their racial innocence. Some incident suddenly makes them realize that they are regarded as inferior. White children may suddenly refuse to play with them, or they find out that they have to sit on the hard wooden seats in the hot, crowded balcony at the movies, as we did, instead of in the comfortable orchestra. Then I always smile a little when I hear white people talking nostalgically about the corner drugstore. I remember when I was a very little girl, having to go to the side door of the white-owned drugstore with the other Negro children to buy an ice cream cone. I would have to wait until all the white children were served, and then, no matter what flavor I asked for, the man would give me whatever he had too much of. Of course, we paid exactly what the white kids paid. Black children realize very early that there are places that they cannot go. When that time comes, they go to their mothers and ask, "Why?" Every Negro mother says, "You are just as good as anyone else. It's just the way things are." With his deep hurt, the child realizes that his mother is trying to explain without explaining, and that she wouldn't have to tell him that if there weren't some problem. And it's hard for a child to believe when everything is rigged to prove that it's not so. When I went to my own mother with this eternal question of black children, she too said, "You're just as good as anyone else." And then she said very forcefully, "You get an education and try to be somebody. Then you won't have to be kicked around by anybody. And you won't have to depend on anyone for your livelihood, not even on a man." My parents taught us to think of education as the first step on the way to freedom. This was particularly true when I was growing up. Mother said to me, "You want clothes and other things now, but once you have an education, if you still want those things, you can get them. The most important thing now is to get an education." The time came when I fully realized how very different our school was from the white children's school. The facilities were certainly separate, but they were extremely unequal. The whites had a fine brick building, though I never set foot in it. I'm sure there were separate classrooms for each grade and all sorts of equipment we never had. I know there was a library. We had no library and very few books. We had to buy our regular textbooks, while the white children were given their books for free. They went to school 9 months of the year, and we went for 7 months. In Mother's time, it was only 3 months. Under these conditions, how could the achievements of black children be equal to those of white children? Yet, going beyond all that, we were, in some respects, luckier than many of the supposedly integrated children in the ghetto schools up north. In many instances, at least, what we were taught was planned for us by our own people, by blacks, for blacks. Many of our schools even had courses in black history. The children of the northern slums were educated under a mass-produced system designed for the majority of white students, which is totally irrelevant to their experiences and which they would neither identify with nor adapt to, and nobody cared whether they did or not. Herein lies the source of black student unrest on many white college campuses today. By late 1937, things were looking up a little for the Scott family. We moved into a bigger house that Daddy rented. It had 6 rooms. At first, we had to share the house with another family, some cousins who lived in the separate section but used the same kitchen. That did not work out very well, and a year and a half later, they moved out. Edith was coming into the courting age, and my father bought a new set of furniture for the living room, of which we were very proud. It was the first time we had a living room, and the first time my sister and I ever had a room of our own. But the pattern of segregation was strong enough to come into our fine new house. I remember the time my father asked a white man to a mill. He was a friend as well as a business acquaintance. We had an argument about whether Daddy should eat with this man. My father thought he should not, but Mother said, "Obie, this is your own home. He's coming as your guest. You sit and eat with him." Edith and I strongly supported her. "No," my father said. "No, I wouldn't feel right doing it." The white man ate alone. My elementary school took me through the 6th grade. Then Mother arranged for Edith and me to go to a much better school 10 miles away in Marion, one that was as good as any school, white or black, in the area. Lincoln High School was a semi-private school when we went there, but it began as a private school. The American Missionary Association started it shortly after the Civil War, when there were no schools for Negroes in the South. They sent white missionary teachers down to teach the former slave children. By the time I went to Lincoln, the faculty was integrated, about half white, half black. Of course, the students were all black. All the white teachers were Northerners, except for one Southern woman. They were dedicated people who were concerned about us and our development as human beings. Black and white teachers lived together in a spirit of brotherhood in the dormitories provided by the school. The white people in Marion generally despised our northern teachers, whom they called radicals and nigger lovers. They considered the school's integrated housing facilities scandalous, and the teachers were fairly isolated in the community. Of course, a few of the townspeople made friends with the teachers. There are some good people in every situation. The faculty at Lincoln was brave and dedicated, and the school had a strong tradition of service to humanity, which was communicated to its students. I feel that the chance to go to such a school made a real difference in my life. Looking back now, so many things that happened to me when I was much younger seem to have been preparing me for life with Martin. Going to the Lincoln School was one of the most important of these. It was quite a sacrifice for our parents to send Edith and me, and later my brother Obie, to Lincoln. The tuition was $4.50 a year for each of us, and that was a lot of money for them to pay. In addition, we had to board with a Negro family in Marion, because it was too far from home to walk. A farmer not only lost a helper when he sent his child away to school, he also had to raise the money for room and board, but there was no alternative. The nearest Negro high school was 20 miles away, and you had to furnish your own transportation. On the other hand, the white children in the area were bused into Marion High School. My sister was the first child I knew in our immediate community to go to high school, though my father had attended Lincoln for 1 year of his own youth. By the time I was a junior at Lincoln, the county agreed to provide some of the funds to transport black rural students to school. The parents also contributed. My father converted one of his trucks into a bus, and my mother drove the children from our area to and from school every day. After that time, I was able to live at home. Lincoln opened the world to me, especially the world of music. Miss Olive J. Williams of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a Howard University graduate, was our music teacher and my ideal. She played the piano, sang, and taught music appreciation to all the students from 7th grade on, and after they reached the 10th grade, she gave private instruction in voice. She also gave private piano lessons to those who could afford the small fee, and directed our 3 choruses. So outstanding were these singing groups that they performed such works as Ballad for Americans and The Messiah annually. We all had to learn to read music, and those who were particularly interested could go much further. I learned to play the flutophone and performed on it in school programs. Of course I sang. I always sang. Miss Williams gave me my first formal voice lesson, and I performed vocal solos as well as sang solos in the choruses. I learned to play the beginning repertoire of many new pianists. Later, on my own, I learned to play hymns, gospel songs, and spirituals. When I was about 15, our church asked me to serve as the choir director and pianist. We had a piano at that time, and I trained the junior choir. The young people of my age were a fine group, and there were some very good singers among them. We did special programs, and one of them was the origin of a format I used for my Freedom concerts many years later. I would choose a song such as Does Jesus Care? And write a narration to go with it. It would tell about some of the problems we as Christians face, and would ask whether anyone cares about us. But Jesus does care. He cares when no one else seems to, and our hearts are in despair. And then I would lead the singing of the song. At Lincoln High School, I was taught to play the trumpet by Frances Thomas, who gave me some lessons on her trumpet. Frances Thomas, secretary to our principal and wife of the social studies and physical education instructor, Cecil Thomas, was to be a continuing influence in my life. She and Cecil was to be of invaluable assistance during our struggle in the civil rights movement. Two of the songs which make up the Freedom concert, which I later developed, were composed by Fran. During that period, my mother, who had played before, began taking lessons again on the church piano. I also taught my Aunt Zimmy, my father's younger sister, to play. She had a very hard life, and music opened a new world to her. After I went away to college, the two of them, Mother and Aunt Zimmy, took over on alternate Sundays as our church pianists, positions which they both still hold. In Marion, I ran into much more racial feeling than I had ever personally known. When we walked to school, the white teenagers would come down the street all abreast and try to knock us off the sidewalk. If we stood our ground, they would call us dirty niggers, and we would call them white trash. Sometimes it looked like a fight, and I was a little frightened, but as a group, we had more courage, and we stood our ground. It never came to blows. During this period, I also took a job doing housework for a white woman in Marion. She expected me to say, "Yes, ma'am," every other word, and to use the back door. I never did either. I was not submissive enough, and I did not last long in her employment. My father was having troubles too. By now he owned 3 trucks, but as he prospered, feeling against him among the poor whites grew stronger. They harassed him and sometimes complained to the police that he was a reckless driver. They would do anything to get him in trouble. On Thanksgiving night in 1942, one of our undertakers, Hampton D. Lee, telephoned Edith and me in Marion to tell us that our house had burned down. The authorities did not investigate at all, supposedly because we lived outside the town limits. However, really, no one cared about what happened to black people. We never definitely found out how the fire started, but it was quite suspicious. All of our beautiful furniture was gone, and we had to stay with Grandfather McMurray. My mother felt abandoned, especially because her mother had died a short time before. She said, "Now I don't have any place to go with Mama gone." Still, my father was not discouraged. He went to work the next day as usual, and by spring had saved enough money to buy a sawmill. The logger who worked in the mill was white, and after my father had owned the mill for about 2 weeks, the logger came to him and said he wanted to buy it. My father said, "No, I don't want to sell." The logger answered, "Well, it won't ever do you no good." The next Monday, when my father went to his sawmill in the woods, he found only ashes. Some white people who were friendly toward my father felt very sorry for him and suggested that he ask for an investigation. But Dad knew it was no use. He went back to work hauling lumber for other people with his truck and turning his thoughts towards other human ventures. My father is such an amazing person. He never became bitter despite all these incidents, all the humiliations and harassments by whites who wanted to keep him down because they saw their own jobs imperiled and because they did not want any black man to rise above his place. Yet my father would say, "There are some good white folks." Many years later, people accepted him as a substantial person, and he could say, "Nobody hates me. I have paid all my debts. My credit is good, and that's because of the way I have conducted myself. I haven't an enemy in the world. And it is true. I know his example helped me not to hate. That and my own deep belief in Christian principles. At Lincoln School, Edith sang alto in the musical group called the Lincoln School Little Chorus, which was well known in Marion for its beautiful singing. Francis and Cecil Thomas had just come to teach at Lincoln, and they had contacts with various Midwestern colleges. They arranged for the little chorus to make a tour. One of the colleges the chorus sang at was Antioch of Yellow Springs, Ohio, and that is how Edith's life and mine were completely changed. 2 years after this concert tour, Edith was to graduate from Lincoln as valedictorian of her class. About this time, Antioch College decided to invite black students to apply for admission and to offer scholarship help to a limited number who could qualify. They remembered the fine young student who had come from Alabama to sing for them 2 years before, and the letter came to our school principal offering a scholarship. Edith and several other students applied, and Edith was awarded a year's scholarship to Antioch, including tuition, room, and board. Thus, in the summer of 1943, she was the first black student to go to Antioch on a completely integrated basis. That it was far away was a main attraction for Edith. She and I both wanted to get out of the South, to go north, because we thought we would enjoy a greater degree of freedom there. In our lack of sophistication, we did not realize that there was special problems we would have to face there, too. Edith's letters home were generally favorable. She was very excited about Antioch and the overall program there. She wrote a lot about the academic freedom and how Antioch stressed giving the students free choices and making them assume responsibility for their actions. There were no house mothers or rules about what time a student had to go to bed. In some exams, certain teachers used the honor system. Edith wrote about how wonderfully warm and friendly the white students were. She said, "Oh, you'll just love it here, Coretta." I think she omitted the negative things because she did not want to discourage me. She felt the good in Antioch outweighed the bad. I found out later how difficult it was for her to be the first representative of her race at the college. The other students thought she should know all the answers about race relations. They talked to her about this subject all the time. Later, she admitted she got awfully tired of discussing the Negroes' problems at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There were other difficulties that were hard to define. For example, my sister is tall and attractive. She has a little of that striking Indian look of my mother's family. Some of the young men at Antioch liked to talk to her because she was intellectually stimulating. She would have lunch with them, and they were attracted to her, but they did not have the courage to ask her out formally. In all the time she was at Antioch, Edith dated only one white fellow on 2 occasions. I was not aware of any of these problems, and I could hardly wait to get to Antioch. When I was in 12th grade, I applied for and got a partial scholarship. It was for $450, and my parents had to pay another $200 in fees, plus my transportation. But then they could manage to scrape the money together. I was tremendously excited, and my first year at Antioch was made easier for me by the fact that Edith was still there. I'd always looked up to her. We were very close, and she had a great influence on my life ever since I can remember, but particularly when we were together in college. She has a quick, brilliant mind and the power to express her thoughts in a dynamic manner. I got into the habit in those days of letting her speak for me, since I was still shy and inexperienced in this new situation. If a question was asked, I would wait for Edith to answer. It was not until my sister had gone to take her senior year at Ohio State that I came into my own. Despite all of Edith's glowing letters, I did not really know what Antioch would be like. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was the friendliness of the people I met. You sensed it at once. Everyone spoke to everyone else. If you were an Antiochian, they accepted you right away and attempted to make you feel at home immediately. It was not until later that I had more experience that I realized that there was, even there, a color bar. People were nice to me and tried to be friendly, but I could sense that in the back of their minds was a feeling of race superiority, bred into them through generations, and the feeling of and by all the myths about the black people they had acquired. It was then that I became aware that Antioch students too were products of a society infested with racism. I must admit, however, that on the whole, Antiochians tried hard to overcome their prejudices. Often they would say naive things, always beginning with, "Of course you're different, Corey." But then they'd ask me the kind of questions I couldn't help resenting. Why were Negroes boisterous, immoral? Why weren't more Negro students qualified for Antioch? What they couldn't understand was that not everyone wants to be a pioneer. There were black students who were qualified and who could afford Antioch, but who would not want to come here because they might be isolated or subjected to special treatment. Also, many Negro parents hoped that their sons and daughters would find suitable wives in colleges and husbands at college. That was most unlikely at a school like Antioch in the mid-1940s, which had only token integration. The student body, though preponderantly white, represented a cross-section of the country. Though it seemed a sizable number were Jewish people from New York. In my class there were 3 black students, myself, another girl, and 1 young man. Counting the Negroes in Edith's class, we made 6 altogether. One of the things I did not like was the unspoken expectation that I would date the Negro fellow on proms and social events. That was not what I wanted, to be socially segregated in this way. Quite deliberately, I refused to date him. I guess it was a little self-conscious of me, but through all the years we were there, I never dated him because I did not want to acknowledge that covert assumption. It was not until my junior year that a white student asked me for a date. He was Jewish, a good musician, and he had a fine mind. We had a great deal in common, and we went steady for a year until he graduated. I roomed with 2 white girls. It took quite an adjustment for all 3 of us. There was no animosity, just a matter of getting used to the situation, and eventually it all worked out very well. At first I had a difficult time with my studies, although I had been valedictorian of my class and had maintained an A average in my senior year. Like most Southern students, I had such an inadequate educational background that even Lincoln had not prepared me properly. I had to become what they used to call a grind. I studied very hard and had little or no time at first for outside reading. That meant so much in the intellectual life of the place. Though later, when my schedule changed, I read a tremendous amount. In my second semester, I enrolled in a remedial reading course. In a sense, I made more progress than some of the students who came with more advantages because I had so far to go to catch up. Then an unfortunate thing happened. I was the first Negro to major in elementary education. This required that I teach a year in the Antioch private elementary school and a year in the Ohio public schools. I was becoming more and more interested in music, so I taught music the first year at the Antioch school. The second year I was supposed to teach in the public elementary school. However, the Yellow Springs school board was very reactionary, and the supervisor of practice teaching at Antioch would not allow me to push the matter when I was turned down. She was the type who openly said God did not intend the races to mix. The Yellow Springs schools were integrated, but the faculty was all white, and she told me that if I forced the issue, it would imperil the whole Antioch practice teaching program. I appealed to the president of Antioch. He was quite new to the school and was no pioneer in racial relations. As a matter of fact, it would be said that he had a black dog called Nigger. After I told him my story, all he said was, "Well, Corey, what do you want us to do about it?" "You might appeal to the school board," I suggested, but on the teaching supervisor's advice, he refused to act. So I was given 2 options. Either I go to Xenia, Ohio, and teach in a segregated Negro school there, or I teach another year at Antioch school. I said, I will not go to Xenia because I came here from Alabama to be free of segregation. I taught in the Antioch school, but I was terribly disillusioned and upset. I had support from my faculty counselors, Walter Anderson and Mrs. Jessie Treichler, who both were very close friends of mine. Jessie Treichler was the member of the faculty who was working to bring black students to Antioch. My good friend and classmate, Sally Plotskin, encouraged me to protest and shared my anger and discouragement. Other teachers and students sympathized with me, and some of them wanted to take specific action, yet nothing helped. Finally, I pulled myself out. I said to myself, now I'm going to to be a Negro the rest of my life, and I have to face these problems. So I'm not going to let this one get me down. I have to accept a compromise now, but I don't have to accept it as being right. I'm going ahead in a more determined way than ever to do something about this situation. I don't want those who come after me to have to experience the same fate I did. From that incident on, I was even more motivated than before. Antioch had a chapter of the NAACP and Race Relations Committee and a Civil Liberties Committee. I was active on all of them. From the first, I had been determined to get ahead, not just for myself, but to do something for my people and for all people. I took to my heart the words of Horace Mann, who founded Antioch. In his address to his first graduating class, he said, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity." Sometimes I'm asked what I think Antioch did for me. It did a great deal beyond the fine education I received. For one thing, it taught me how to get on in a white community. Even its hypocrisies, like the lack of support given me against the Yellow Springs School Board, taught me not to expect too much, and to make allowances for, without condoning, the inbred things white people have difficulty with. It reinforced my idea that one ought not to think too much about material things such as clothes. At Antioch, clothes were downgraded. If I had gone to another kind of school, even to some Negro colleges, I might have been able to manage financially, since I would have had to spend I might not have been able to manage financially, since I would have had to spend more money on clothes. Every student at Antioch alternates periods of work and study. You are required to hold a real job every other semester and to write an evaluation of your job experience as part of the curriculum. I worked as a waitress in the dining room, and I took the job as a camp counselor at Karamu Camp, which belonged to a settlement house that specialized in the arts and music. I also worked for 5 months at the Friendly Inn settlement house in one of the worst slum areas in Cleveland. I worked at several other places, including the Science Library, the Music Library at Antioch, and the Antioch Yellow Springs Day Nurseries, and the Riverside branch of the New York Public Library. One of my jobs was to go home and help my father in the general store he had opened in 1946. I set up a system of bookkeeping for him, ordered supplies, and waited on customers. Antioch gave me credit for that job, too. In all these jobs, I learned not only techniques, but also how to work with people and under people. I kept the job evaluation I wrote after each assignment, and when I read them now, I see myself as an eager, vulnerable young girl I've almost forgotten. It was at Antioch that I seriously began to study music. Walter F. Anderson came to Antioch that fall as head of the music department. He became one of the most popular professors in the college, and it was he who coached me for my first public concert given in Springfield, Ohio in 1948. The concert was well received, and I did quite a few other concerts while I was still a student. The total Antioch experience helped me reaffirm and deepen the values which I had already acquired during my childhood and adolescence, in my parents' home and at Lincoln High School. Though they were born disadvantaged, my parents always aspired for the best. My father used to say that he always stood at the head of his class, and he encouraged us to do our very best, no matter what the task, especially where we are encouraged to excel in our studies. The Antioch program, with its emphasis on the total development of the individual, helped me to grow in this direction. Striving for excellence became an integral part of my personality. Antioch's pioneering, experimental approach to educational problems reaffirmed my belief that individuals as well as society could move toward the democratic ideal of brotherhood. Its emphasis on service to mankind reinforced the Christian spirit of giving and sharing, which had been taught to me by my parents, particularly my father. The embodiment of this spirit was in the dedicated lives of our teachers. Was a further inspiration to us. Antioch was a place which offered many opportunities for development. Even as a student, I had the unusual experience of appearing on a program with the then world-famous baritone Paul Robeson, who commended my voice and encouraged me to continue my voice studies. By the time I left Antioch, I knew I wanted to develop my voice to its fullest potential. This made it imperative that I consider training in a conservatory of music. What did Antioch do for me? In short, Antioch gave me an increased understanding of my own personal worth. I was no longer haunted by a feeling of inadequacy just because I was a Negro. I enjoyed a new self-assurance that encouraged me in competition with all people of all racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds, on their terms or on mine. Antioch, the total experience of Antioch, was an important element in preparing me for the role I was to play as the wife of Martin Luther King, Jr., and for my part in the movement he led.